Hey guys, it's me. It's been forever, I know, but I'm back and I'm back with a vengeance. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create this awesome 80s inspired cake. Not only is it 80s on the outside, it's 80s on the inside. I'm not technically an 80s kid, but I was only 5 years old when they arrived, so I got to live through a heck of a lot of it. I'll let you do the math. All right guys, get your big hair done, your skinny tie on, and your Fluro ready. We're about to head in to the 80s. All right, let's get this 80s party started. So I decided with this cake that considering the outside was an 80s theme, I wanted to make the flavor an 80s theme too. And something that is dear to my heart is the memory of being picked up from school on a Friday and it being Ice Cream Friday. Pick any ice cream you wanted. Without fail, I would always pick a Peter's Scona.
Puree of tangy apricots, S-K-O-N-A. The accents on the... You gotta get a hold of a cold Peter's Scona.
Now I don't know how many of you remember them, but they were very left of center when it came to ice cream. It was vanilla ice cream churned with coconut, sesame seeds and sunflower seeds. And straight through the middle was a delicious, chunky, zingy apricot compote. So what I did was make 2 vanilla 5-inch round cakes. I split them and then I filled them with a Swiss meringue buttercream that included sesame seeds, coconut and sunflower seeds. I did a dam of that around the outside of each layer and then filled the middle layer with a homemade apricot compote. It's Scona in a cake. I can't wait to eat this. Now me being me and being impatient and all that sort of stuff, which I am, I went ahead and crumb coated my cake with very runny ganache. Yep, I overheated it, but I made it work. So do as I say, don't do as I do. Make sure that your ganache is the right consistency to do this. It was very messy, but I got there in the end. You then want to pop your cake into the fridge or freezer to chill for about 5 or 10 minutes before proceeding. Now the cake was ready for its good ganache coat, and I want to know how you spell game changer. I'm sure I used to spell it exactly the same as you. However, now I spell it P-R-O-F-R-O-S-T-E-R. Profroster. Where have you been all my life? Guys, if you haven't tried out this little gadget yet, please do so. It just made everything so much easier. I didn't have to put a top board onto my cake as a guide. I just went ahead and used the Profroster to get perfectly straight up and down edges and a sharp, flat top. Thanks Tracy from Little Cherry Cake Company for putting me on to that one. After I'd done that coat, I put it aside to chill once again, bored it back and just refined it. And ta-da, we have a beautifully ganache cake. Now we're moving the cake aside and moving on to the next step. Okay, so let's get on to making the plaques for the top of the cake. Now I scoured the internet and found some really cool 80s themes logo. I found this one in particular that I really loved and decided I'd give this one a go. Now of course you've always got the option, if you have an edible ink printer, which I do, you could always use that for this instead and place the image on a backing piece of fondant. But if you like to make life difficult for yourself, like I do it this way. So I firstly took that plaque and I cut around the outside. That gave me the initial template. Now as you can see on the back, it's white. So the first color I rolled out using modeling paste was white. I took the template and I cut around that with an X-Acto knife. Just smooth the edges with my fingers. Then I went ahead and started cutting out the smaller pieces from that template. So I went ahead and I did the heart. I did that in a bright pink. I did the eye and that was in a fluoro green. And then the part that says 80s at the bottom, I took some black fondant that I'd put some Tylos in to stiffen it up and initially cut around the black area. I popped that aside, then cut the template down again, wrote out some electric blue modeling paste and went to cut around that. And this is where I ran into a few problems. Because the paste was so thin and so soft, it did pull quite a lot and I didn't get the perfect shape that I'd want. In hindsight, I would probably use fondant with Tylos for the entire plaque. I was having trouble getting the openings of the 8 and the 0 cut cleanly, so what I quickly did was chucked it in the freezer, let it freeze up for a minute and very, very hastily cut out those openings. It certainly did help a bit. Once they were all done, I popped that aside and I rolled out a thin strip of grey modelling paste, checking sure to make sure I had enough to go around the entire perimeter of the plaque. Once I did, I placed some water around the outside of that plaque and made sure that I put loads of corn flour on the board it's sitting on to stop it sticking. I then ran that grey paste around the perimeter of the plaque using a silicone shaping tool to sort of pop it into the awkward corners. Now that that's done, I have to start placing the icon and the text for the plaque in the middle of the plaque. So firstly, I lined it up and made sure that everything was fitting okay. I did end up cutting around the eye and going into the heart. You can just overlap them, that's fine, but I was being a little bit extra. And then using a little bit of water on a paintbrush, I just went ahead and stuck those where they were meant to be. Now, of course, me being me, using black fondant on white, I made a few little boo-boos. There were a few little black marks, so I just took a cotton tip with a little bit of water and cleaned that up. Now I want to add the little catch lights that are on the 80s and the heart. So for that, I'm just using white modeling paste rolled into teardrop shapes. And I touch them with some water also. Last but not least, there's the text that says "the," which makes it I love the 80s instead of I love 80s. And for that, I just traced over the template straight onto the modeling paste to leave an indent. And using an edible black marker, I went over the top and just wrote in "the." A couple of skewers very carefully placed into the bottom of the plaque and set that aside to dry. Plaque 1 done. Now on to making the roller skate. So I did end up switching over and I used fondant with Tylos for this piece. So once again, I scrolled the internet. Now when you go on the internet and look for the images, you want to look up something like roller skate PNG or roller skate clip art. I found an image I liked and printed it to the size I wanted, and then I cut around that again using it as a template. I rolled out my white fondant with Tylos added, and I placed the template over the top, and with a small rolling pin, I just rolled over the top of that to make the impression on the fondant. Once again, with a craft knife, I cut around the entire perimeter. I then went ahead and, using the template as my guide, marked out all the lines that were already on the actual roller skate. And I decided to make a couple of the bits 3D. The wheels are one thing I decided to make 3-dimensional. I rolled out some pink paste and some white paste, and using small circle cutters, just cut out circles and place them on top of one another and put them where they're meant to be on the roller skate. A small dot of black fondant in the center finished them off. I then rolled out some blue, yellow and pink paste very thinly and cut tiny strips out of each of the colors. I laid them across the body of the roller skate to make like a bit of a detail and attached them with some water. I made bootlace holes, and then with some black fondant I rolled that out really thinly, and with small pieces I just placed one in each of the lace holes, wrapped them over and secured them with water. I rolled out some yellow paste and cut that into the shape of the stopper and just wrapped that around the stopper. And then I used a black edible marker to make all the other details on the boot, including the stitching. I then just took some black airbrush color and painted in black down the very bottom of the boot. And that was it, the roller skate was done. Awesome! Okay, so I've got a quick tip for you to dry these pieces evenly. Just take a foam mat that's usually used for flower making and place your fondant pieces on top of that. This way the air gets in through the top and through the bottom and it dries more evenly. Okay, on to the next. Okay, it's time to make probably the most fiddly of all the elements that go on top of the cake. Let's make the little mixtape, the cassette. So firstly what I did, I added some Tylose powder to some black fondant because black fondant tends to be really sticky. This will help it firm up. Once again, using a template, I placed that on top of the black fondant and rolled out the impression. To get straight edges, I ended up using a smoother that I bought from a hardware store that's stainless steel and very thin. So I just cut around the outside of that template, and because now I've sort of got sharper edges, I just smooth those edges with my fingers, rounding them out. I rolled out a really thin piece of green modeling paste, and using my template again and a Dresden tool, I marked around the template so I knew where to cut, including the little part in the center. I removed my template, and using my craft knife, I cut around the edges that I'd marked out. I just popped that on top to make sure we were going to fit. Taking some thinly rolled out grey modeling paste, I used the template again and got the grey section from the bottom and repeated the process. I also cut out 2 very small circles from a piping tip. With the grey band along the bottom, I used even smaller piping tips to cut out a couple of little circles. And then using that cutter, I just put some lines into that paste, very lightly impressing it. Now we pop that aside. I rolled out some white modeling paste this time, and then I just cut out a long rectangle piece which will be the label for the top of the tape. Now for the tricky part. So now you're going to need some really small circle cutters. I've got 2 that are very close in size to one another. With that white modeling paste, I take the smallest circle cutter first and cut out a small hole. Now I take the slightly larger cutter, which in my case is a large piping tip, and I center that over the top of the circle that we've just cut out. Now to tidy up any ragged edges, I just took a soft paintbrush and ran it around the inside of that cutter or piping tip to make sure that when we pop out our little circle, it's nice and tidy. And then I popped it out. Pop that aside, and then with the same fondant cut out a very, very thin strip of white. And this is pretty fiddly. So I wet the underside of our hollow circle. And then I went ahead very carefully and placed thin strips of white fondant in a crisscross pattern on top of that circle. Once it was all done, I dusted it really well on both sides so we didn't get any sticking, and took an even smaller cutter, another piping tip, and cut those crisscrosses right in the center. It was fiddly, but we have our tape cog. Of course, you have to go ahead and do that twice. Now bring all the elements back in, and using a little bit of water, put everything onto the tape. Voila, we're done. Okay, just a few more little bibs and bobs to do on the toppers, and then we can move on and finish up the cake. I wanted to make some edgy sort of patterns for the top of the cake also. So what I did was rolled out some white fondant and left it a little bit thicker maybe than the other elements. Using a sharp straight blade, I cut it into a bit of a long trapezium shape. Then with the same white fondant, just take a circle cutter that will fit into the trapezium shape and cut out a circle. Using the same circle cutter, cut out a small section of the circle into the trapezium, and that circle will fit straight in. Hold a fondant smoother over the top of your shape and just place a couple of toothpicks into the bottom. This will help it to stand up on the cake when it's time to add them. Trim up any edges that may have moved around and set them aside to dry. Now, a little thing I forgot to show you. I didn't actually place skewers into the roller skate, nor did I into the cassette tape. So I'm going to show you how I add them without warping the shape. So take your piece and place it upside down on a piece of foam matting to make sure that it doesn't get damaged. I just paint a little bit of water on the back where I'm going to place the skewer and put the skewer on top. Now rolling out the coinciding coloured paste, white for the roller skate, black for the tape, I then place a very thin rectangle of that fondant over the top of the skewer, making sure that the top of the skewer is completely covered. I press that fondant around the skewer, making sure it's nice and secured, and then take a damp paintbrush and just paint around it, making sure it's all attached properly. And that's it. Pop that aside to dry and they'll be ready to go on too. Now let's finish up the cake. So now it's time to decorate the cake. The first thing you want to do is take some baking paper and wrap it around the outside of your cake, measure where it meets up, and measure where the top of the cake is. Remove the baking paper and cut it to size. Now you want to split it in half, lay the now folded baking paper down on a cutting mat, take a ruler and a pencil and mark from the top left corner to the bottom right corner. Then, using a craft knife, cut down that line. Open it up and we have the template for the pattern around the cake. Okay, now roll out a piece of fondant that's large enough for that template to fit in. You want this to be super duper thin. Once you've done that, pop that aside. I cover mine with a bit of plastic wrap just to stop it drying out. Now this next method is really popular in the polymer clay community. Try saying that 5 times fast. We're going to make a fondant cane. So I've taken some pink, blue, green and yellow fondant and I've rolled it into very thick logs. I just checked that they're all pretty even in size, cutting them down to make sure. Then I place 2 together, squashing them in, 1 on the top and 1 on the bottom. And now we roll. Continue to roll these out into long snakes. Now the thicker the snake, the larger the colour blocks are going to be, and it's completely up to you. Once you've rolled it out, you want to cut the snake into about 1 centimetre slices. Now bring your white fondant back, cover it in a little bit of water, and start pushing your canes onto the white fondant. Once it's pretty well covered, cut off the excess white fondant, take your rolling pin and start rolling it out. Now there's going to be sections that aren't going to fuse together overly well. Just take your fingers and tease them together and they will eventually join. You'll see that I've made a few mistakes here. I even tore a little bit, but because of the pattern I was able to put it back together and you would never know. Once again, make sure you've got a large enough area of the colour pattern to fit your template in. To the template, add a good amount of vegetable shortening and attach it to your fondant, smoothing it down. Once again, take your ruler and a knife and cut around the template. And don't forget, don't throw any of that excess away. You are going to need it. Now it's time to attach it to the cake. Add some water to the back of that fondant on the template. Hold the template up to the side of the cake and gently smooth it around the outside. Once it's smoothed onto the cake, remove the baking paper and ta-da! She's on! Now you might need to pop a few little air bubbles that may have formed underneath, and that's okay. Just use an acupuncture needle and they'll come out easily. I also ended up using a tissue just to buff away a little bit of that excess vegetable shortening. Now it's ready to do the finishing touches. Okay, now we're just going to do a little bit of refining. So what you want to do is take a little bit of water and run some water with a paintbrush along the separation line between the colour and the white section on the cake. Not too much because we're adding black, and if it smudges, you'll certainly know about it. Set the cake aside, take some black fondant and roll it out into a thin snake. Make sure you've got enough that it's going to go all the way around the cake. Once you've done that, bring the cake back. And at the halfway mark of the snake you've just rolled out, attach it to the point of the coloured section of the cake. Run the rest of the snake down each separation line. Turn the cake around. Where the black snakes overlap, just make a small cut and pop them together. I also took my craft knife, and where the point is, I ended up slicing the top of the black off there, making it flush with the top of the cake. Now remember how I said to save that color blocked fondant from before? Well, this is why. We're going to cover those white trapeziums and circles that we cut out earlier. You just want to lay the fondant down, color side down. Take one of the shapes and lightly paint the water on the front side. Lay that down onto the colored fondant and then cut around it. Now our trapeziums are nice and coloured. We couldn't really do this in all coloured fondant simply because the coloured fondant is so thin. That's why we've got a nice thick backing in that white fondant. Now let's put it all together. Now you just want to go ahead and start adding all the elements on top. Just go little by little and place them where you like them. To attach the circle to the trapezium that I've created for the top, I just used a little bit of piping gel. Now I did heighten the sign at the back because you can't really read it properly, but we know it's there. But because I heightened that sign, of course you could see the skewers. I wanted to cover them up. So I went ahead and I used some of that leftover color blocked fondant and cut it into strips. And then I just wrapped it around a small wooden dowel. I slid it off the dowel, cut them in half, and set them aside to set up a little. I also cut out some zigzags from some black fondant. I popped the little streamers around the cake, hiding those skewers in the process, added a black zigzag to one of the trapezium, then I went ahead and just cut a couple of extra trapeziums and another circle to place on the white section of the cake. Another black zigzag went on there too. And we're done! Apparently the 80s is back in fashion, so an 80s cake for somebody from the 80s or somebody that just loves the 80s. Well guys, thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I hope you really enjoyed it. Don't forget that if you did, to give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you're informed every time I upload a new video. Doing these couple of things will really help me get ahead, and it costs you nothing. Well, it's time to go and eat this rad cake. And in the meantime, you know what you've got to do. Go and get your cake on. See you next time, guys. Bye-bye.